We get done with the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. Everybody seems cool with the game plan. Peter is going to keep working with the Jewish people who are responding to Jesus. Paul is going to go out and try to talk to people who are not Jewish and take it to the wider world. And they even seem to come to an agreement on just some of these more technical details about how to do life in community and so forth. And that's it. We don't really get any more Peter. For the rest of the narrative part of the New Testament, we don't hear from him. Now, we got a couple letters from Peter later on, and in a couple of the letters that Paul writes, we get allusions, I think particularly in Galatians. I'm pretty sure it's Galatians. I'm not even going to look. We get allusions to Peter and maybe even a little tension there that worked itself out. So clearly, both Peter and Paul wanted to make it abundantly clear that we are cool with each other. You might have heard about friction. Hey, that's what happens when you get a couple of alphas together, but we've always been able to deal with it. We're moving forward with this whole kingdom thing. And that's pretty much it. That's where the character goes from there. So Peter dominates the first half of Acts, and then the baton of the story gets handed to Paul and his traveling companions for the second half of Acts. And that's kind of it. That's what you have that's officially in the Bible. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's not in the Bible that it comes with varying degrees of reliability. There are some much later sort of books of the Bible, fan fiction looking kind of things that come along, maybe 150, 200 years after the fact, that talk about some things from Peter's life that sound kind of like him, but also that sound like they don't totally square with what we know about history from all the other sources. There are some accounts of Peter going to war in like a miracle contest. I don't know that that's supported anywhere outside that well-known fan fiction document, but the existence of such fan fiction documents tells us that people were still really interested in the life and influence of Peter 100 years later, 150 years later, 200 years later, because it looks like the early church viewed him as somewhere between the most important and influential apostle in the Mediterranean world or among the most influential. Surely John goes on to wield huge influence. Surely Paul is wielding huge influence. But we'll break all of that down more thoroughly when we're done with the book of Matthew and we're kind of doing our epilogue there. More reliable sources on Peter after the fact include tons of the rock star names of generation 3, 4, 5, and 6 of Christian leaders who come after the fact, who develop the tradition. Maybe it's real, maybe it's not. I have no idea. If you ask a Catholic, they'll say inarguably true. If you ask an Orthodox Christian, they'd say maybe true. If you ask anybody else, it's a coin flip as to what their opinion will be. But meaningfully later tradition developed stating that Peter did get crucified. It seems like everybody is pretty much in agreement that that's how he died. A little later on, yet tradition develops that he was crucified upside down so as not to be crucified in the same manner as his Lord. He thought that was too much, and so he wanted to be crucified upside down. And those traditions are connected with a couple of later church scholars named Origen and Jerome. If you don't know who those people are, that's absolutely fine. Origen was a theology guy who's a fascinating cat. Jerome is the guy who translated the Bible into Latin. According to Catholic tradition, St. Peter's Basilica, which is that's like the headquarters of Catholicism. It's beautiful. It's amazing. It's loaded with tradition. Some of the really challenging, tricky stuff about the most difficult years of Catholicism happened there. Some of the noblest, bravest stuff in even a physical defense of that basilica happened there. Multiple buildings have stood on that site, but supposedly St. Peter's Basilica is on the site of the Emperor Nero's circus, which is, of course, like a big horse racing track that the Romans would have been entertained at. And tradition holds that Peter was crucified at that particular attraction, at that racetrack, that circus, by Nero in, I think, 64 AD is what people guess. I guess I've heard a few guesses a little later. I don't know. Don't hold me to it on that exact date. But the idea there is that, hey, long term, this Roman power, it didn't hold up. The power of the kingdom and the church, it did hold up. And so St. Peter's, somewhat ironically, sits right over the top of the traditional location of his execution by the Emperor Nero, which is a pretty interesting tidbit. But if we try to make a composite as we chase down what happened to Peter afterwards, since he's now off screen in the book of Matthew, if we try to put together a composite of all of it, it looks like it's pretty safe to say that after helping to get the church on its feet and helping to keep everybody pulled together during difficult times after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus, after being there for the day of Pentecost, the gigantic kind of launch day of Christianity out to the larger world, and after helping to navigate some of the trickiness of what it looks like to take this message out to a non-Jewish, larger global audience, Peter fades into the background of the Bible a little bit, but not into the background of what was happening in Christianity. It looks like he didn't travel as extensively as the Apostle Paul. It looks like he threw a lot of energy in the next chunk of his career, if you will, at working with Jewish people and answering questions about how Jesus is the completion of all of the stuff in the Old Testament, something that he started in Acts chapter 2 with a couple sermons he gave there. And then it looks like maybe in the last chunk of his life, he traveled a little more broadly in Gentile territory, did wield influence at the church in Rome. There are traditions, well, there is a tradition, Roman Catholicism, that would say, like, effectively he even served as the first Pope of Rome and effectively moved the epicenter, the headquarters of Christianity, with him to that place, so that the spiritual heritage handed down from one leader to the next went through Peter, who was commissioned by Jesus in Matthew 16, and on down to successive leaders of the church in Rome, which gradually comes to view itself as the Western church in general, not trying to pick any fights or make anything feel weird, but people have different reads on historically what exactly to do with those claims. Catholics, of course, being the most enthusiastic about saying that Peter was uniquely commissioned to be the singular leader of the church moving forward, and upon his death had the ability to hand off those keys that Jesus talked about in Matthew 16 to successive spiritual leaders, who would then also have the ability to hand off those keys to bind and loose on earth and in heaven, as Peter was given such ability. Orthodox and Protestants read that differently. And as always, you can read it however you want, because it's the internet, and that's part of the fun of what we do here. Finally, I think we can say with relative certainty that Peter did travel with Mark, that Peter did talk a lot about what he saw when he was there as an eyewitness to all of these things. I think Christians around the Mediterranean world were fascinated by what Paul had to say, but Paul dealt more primarily in abstract, big picture theology, whereas Peter, he could give an actual account of what he saw and what the grass looked like that day, and that the 5,000 got fed. And so Mark takes on a little bit more boots on the ground kind of tone than, say, Luke or Acts or things like that, because it looks like young Mark and older Peter really were connected, and Mark is reflective of the recollections of Peter along the way, probably including a whole bunch of repetitions of the whole story of Jesus and everything that happened that Peter gave toward the end of his life in Rome before his execution at the hands of Nero. So the point is, Peter does get his story rounded out pretty well the rest of the way through the Bible, but the Bible is not a dictionary of saints. The Bible is not an HBO premium streaming TV show that needs to fully see through each and every character arc, because the human characters aren't really the point of the Bible. God is the main character of the Bible. That character arc is seen through all the way, even though God doesn't change. We're not really seeing a character who evolves and grows and figures some things out about himself with God. He's immutable and unchanging. Rather, we're seeing a God who gradually reveals and unleashes his redemptive plan, culminating in the stuff that we're seeing with Jesus here in the book of Matthew. The Bible then, in general, never really gives us this sense of promise as readers that we get the answers for how everything worked out for everybody. We get almost nothing on how things worked out for all the rest of the disciples, something we'll look at later on when we're into the epilogue of Matthew. Peter is actually pretty anomalaic in that regard, that we do get a sense a bit more of what happened to him. And because he is sort of our point of view character, the character through whom we empathetically encounter the story of Jesus in Matthew, it seemed like it would be a good idea to trace down that story as far as we could, so that we can sort of close the book for the moment on our friend, our colleague, our brother in arms, our fail in similar ways buddy, Peter, and get on to the rest of what happens in Matthew 27 and 28. This has been nice. Thanks for doing yet more Bible jaunting with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.